It was the slide seen round the world, round after round. All eyes were on Shedeur Sanders, whose name was never called until the 5th round of the NFL draft Saturday, when the Cleveland Browns made Sanders the second quarterback they'd draft over the weekend. The Browns traded up with the Seattle Seahawks to select Sanders with the 144th overall pick.
I just say the biggest thing for us, we live by our board. We felt like he was a good, solid prospect at the most important position. We felt like it got to a point where he was probably mispriced, relative to the draft. Really the acquisition cost was pretty light, and it's a guy that we think can outproduce his draft slot. So I wouldn't say it's any more than that. Obviously Shedeur has kind of grown up in the spotlight. But, our expectation is for him to come in here and work and compete. Nothing's been promised. Nothing will be given. So, I may, hesitate to characterize it as a blockbuster. That's not necessarily how we thought of the transaction. But we are excited to work with him.
Okay, that was Browns GM Andrew Berry. Lewis, good morning. Damian, good morning. All right, gentlemen, I sat on this set Friday, all of us, right, as the first round went. And I tried to look at the positive. Hey, blessing in disguise. Maybe he'll be in a better situation. None of us thought he was going to slide to the 5th round. Lewis, what happened, and is this fair to Shedeur?
Well, Molly, I don't think, look, the draft isn't about fairness. That's really not what it's about. And I think the reason why I say that is because I've said numerous different times, this whole process is very subjective, all right? It's very opinionated. There's human beings who are trying to assess players and their fit relative to the NFL and relative to their own, individual franchises. And that's an ongoing year-long process, multi-year long process, because scouts, even though we're primarily concentrating on Shedeur, this year and maybe even last year, it's one of those things where they're compiling a bunch of information both on the field and off the field for a number of different months. And then as it gets down to the wire, there's a lot of things that come into it that really don't have to do with your play on the football field, in particular quarterback. And there's a lot of other people that come into the whole thing when you're talking about then trying to set your final board. I think with Shedeur, look, I've said this numerous different times. This was not a on-the-field thing for me, because you are not going to ever tell me that Shedeur Sanders was worthy of a 5th-round selection based strictly off of what he did on the football field. What this came down to is somewhere in the off-the-field process, okay, when you're trying to assess someone's personal and football character and whether or not they feel as though it warrants a certain level or a certain price to be paid in order to acquire his services, people didn't feel that way. People just did not feel that way. As I said on Sunday or on Saturday to Mel Kiper, the draft is spoken. Whether we like it or not, the draft spoke. And somewhere along the line, people were not comfortable with the risk that would be associated with taking him in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th round. That doesn't mean I agree with it. That doesn't mean that anybody agrees with it. That just means that that's what the teams felt. So now for him, he's going to have to go back and look at that process and say, hey, look, what was it during that process that somehow made these people, meaning the 32 teams, feel as though I wasn't worthy of being? I love Dillon Gabriel as a person. Watched him live as a player multiple times. No, he's better than Dillon Gabriel.
That's right.
He's a better football player than Dillon Gabriel. Okay, as simple as that. What I wanted to say, though, is this. Stephen, I've said multiple times, of course Deion's specter, Deion's aura, Deion's presence has something to do with this. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the process that has nothing to do with on the football field. When teams are evaluating Shedeur from January, February, March, April, all of that comes along with him, his, the people who are with him, the people who are going to be his inner circle, how's he going to be as far as how's he going to be advised, what's, all the people who play a prominent role in his life, and they're advising him, directing him, influencing him. Of course, teams evaluate all of that. Some people are going to be very, very influenced and very intimidated by the magnitude of Deion Sanders. Of course they are. Of course they are. What I said, though, was this. When you're going through this process, you have to do a certain amount of making sure that you convince the 32 different teams that they're going to get something that does nothing but benefit their organization on and off the field. And you have to eliminate as many questions as you can, so then it really just becomes about your play on the field. Because his play on the field warranted him being picked much higher than he was picked. But this was not about that. This was about everything else. I know it was about everything else because there was no other reason for him to fall. This was about the process, to me, from January up until the day that the draft happened, that somewhere along the line teams got uncomfortable with it.
I feel like
it's so layered. It's so layered.
Well, but let's get into the layers.
You'll never get a straight answer about it.
We're dancing around it. So why is Deion to blame? Or how could Shedeur have been better in the interviews? Like, let's get to what really went down.
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Lewis. Go ahead.
No, I'll say this. Look, I wasn't in the interviews. I wasn't in the interview at the Combine. I wasn't at his, in his interviews that he had with teams in private workouts. The question, that question needs to be directed to the people who were interviewing him. What was it about him that you didn't like? What was it about his preparation, like supposedly with the New York Giants and Brian Daboll? Why did you confront him? What was the issue? How was he not prepared? What does that exactly mean to you? What does that mean? There's a lot of things that are kind of like I said, there's a lot of information that only the teams can give you because they're the ones who passed on him. It wasn't me that passed on him. I would have taken the guy given what I know about him.
All right, let's get everyone else in here.
Listen, I think, first of all, Stephen A., there's a word you use collusion. I think we got to be very careful with the word collusion because I don't think to me, the talent plays a big role in this whole situation. Because even when you brought up Colin Kaepernick, if Colin Kaepernick was the Colin Kaepernick from, 4 or 5 years prior, he wouldn't have been in that situation. I think this about Shedeur Sanders. If Shedeur Sanders had the talent of Caleb Williams, will we even be having this discussion right here and right now? Hell no. If Shedeur Sanders had Caleb Williams' talent, regardless of how everything is played out, the discussions we're having about Deion Sanders and all of that, he would have still been the number 1 pick because ultimately teams value talent over everything. Teams are in the winning business.
Hold on,
they are in the winning business.
Well, we got to hear from Stephen A. Go ahead, Stephen A.
I'm looking at it in the reverse, Woody. I'm not questioning if he were Caleb Williams, would this have happened? I know better. I'm not questioning if this is Jayden Daniels, it would have happened. I know better. What I'm saying is, rather than ask that question about the inordinate amount of talent those guys have, how about asking the question, it's deeper than me that it's in the 5th round? Because he's not a 5th round. That is a precipitous drop. And so when you remember when I said collusion, I said they don't have to collude. It's a universal understanding. They understand one another. They don't have to conspire with one another. They know how they think. It's about control. It's their product. And if Deion Sanders, and again, I'm not blaming him for it. I'm talking about the kind of excuses, the kind of mentality, and I'm going to prove it to you in 1 second. In terms of him saying what he said and them wanting to send a message, nah, we ain't having that. This is our league. Do you remember when the owners with the TV deal? Remember during the whole Colin Kaepernick situation where it reached the point where the owners, Lewis and Dane, got like 250